By the way, are you? No, we're thinking alike. Okay. So we share this building with the National Portrait Gallery. And the next slide is a picture of our other location, the Renwick Gallery, which is near the White House. That's what you see kind of lit up in warm oranges and reds. I have a detail of the stonework above the door where it says dedicated to art. This has the distinction of being the first purpose-built art museum in the United States. It opened to the public, I think, 1874. Of course, there were other art museums in the country, but they were not in buildings built to be an art gallery. And this has history tied up with Corcoran, who built it and later outgrew this location and moved to a larger building down the street. And after that, it became a sort of a courtroom for the federal government. And Jackie Kennedy helped save it from demolition in the 1960s, and it came to the came to the Smithsonian. It's named Renwick for the architect James Renwick, who also designed the castle building that the Smithsonian has for its headquarters. And we're celebrating our 50th anniversary at the Renwick with a really wonderful exhibition of American craft, a lot of contemporary work by underrepresented population of this country. So I hope you all get to see that show. So with that introduction, let's move on to what we're here to talk about today. This is We Are Made of Stories is the name of the exhibition. And this is on the first floor of our large building. And it's all about self-taught artists. There are 43 different artists in the exhibition. Many of them, about half of them, were actually born in the 1800s, but all of them started making art in the 1900s. About half of them are African American, and two of them are still alive. So this is self-taught, meaning none of these people learned in art school. They may have some experience of art in like a cultural tradition, but they used what they saw, like carving. They didn't make traditional things. They made things to tell their own story in their own way with their art and craft. So they have made personal records of their experiences and their lives with what you see in this exhibition. We celebrate a lot of these artists with a lot of diversity, race, class, and cognition. Some of them are differently abled. They have brought a new perspective to American art. We also note that there are fewer females than males, and there are several pieces in the exhibition itself that are by anonymous. So females have been underrepresented in art until recently. They've been even more ignored and overlooked than many of the male self-taught artists. And many of these artists you'll see would still be overlooked if it weren't for somebody in the sort of mainstream art world championing, is that a word? Their art and getting it shown in galleries. Some of these artists eventually got their work in really major galleries like the MoMA or the Met in New York City, the Whitney. Some remain much lesser known. Some were not known until after they died. So we will take a look at their art and also their stories and what we're going to see. Checking the time. So let's just go ahead and move on to the next slide in our first artist. And what I'm doing with this is I'm going to show you the piece of art first without any text with it, no title, no artist, no date. I can give you a clue to the size. This one is about 23 inches tall by 14 inches wide. And what I would love for you to do is just take a look at this and react to it without any of those clues. Just what do you think is going on there? What catches your eye? What are you curious about? What do you think the story is that the artist is trying to record in this piece of art? Is there something that you're more curious about in this drawing than other things? So I would love to see some response to this in the chat. If it's one word response or you have a sentence, go ahead and type something in. What do you see? What do you wonder about? Or if you'd rather not type, you're welcome to unmute yourself.
The difference in size between the animals and the people.
Difference in size, really big animals. Two different animals and some people doing something on the bottom. Person at bottom has one leg. People at the bottom. Yeah, I think most of the story there is the people at the bottom. What's going on? And you can probably tell from sort of the background of this that it's not like a canvas. It's not like anything fancy this person has found to do this on. This is basically some random piece of paper they found. So I will tell you about this artist, and I believe this is in the group of 43 artists of this exhibition. This person would have been born the longest ago. He was born in 1853. Go to the next slide, please, Joan, with the text on it. So, like many pieces in the show, it's basically untitled, but they were given sort of a subtitle that is descriptive. The artist is Bill Traylor, and this was made in 1939. So let me tell you about Bill Traylor. He was born enslaved in Alabama, 1853. He got his last name from the people who owned the plantations that he was enslaved by. So he worked on the plantations. Afterwards, after emancipation, he continued to work as a sharecropper and tenant farmer, never learned to read or write. His signature at the top of this, somebody later taught him how to sign his name, how to write his name. And he didn't always remember exactly how that went. So you can see the bill pretty easily, but the trailer part is a little more obscure. So as an adult, he lived long enough to have 3 wives and at least 14 children. Most of those children became part of the Great Migration and left Alabama for other parts of the country. When he was no longer able to work as a farmer, he moved to Montgomery, Alabama, worked as a shoe repair person for a while, and eventually was unable to do that and basically became homeless. At that time, in the early 1940s, Montgomery had a thriving Black community, and they took over taking care of him so that he had a place to sleep. So often during the day, he would just be sitting outside a store and he gathered up scraps of paper. Often his artwork was on the back of a sign or something that was discarded, and used pencil. The horse and the dog you see on this probably go back to his experience working on a farm. He was very familiar with animals. Now, he did not himself leave written descriptions of anything that he drew. He started his artwork around 1939. And a group of progressive white artists in Montgomery noticed him drawing and were impressed with what he was doing and gave him some better materials, sometimes like some paints or better paper or pencils. And after he died, they collected what they could of his work and were able to get it into museums. So they were the impetus for him not being forgotten. Like so many people, if they don't connect with the right people to champion their work, they are forgotten. So one of the people in that artist community would sometimes write on the back something that Traylor may have said about the piece of art, but because Traylor himself was illiterate, we don't have anything directly from him. He had diabetes late in life. He did die in 1949, and he lost a leg due to diabetes. So this could be sort of a self-portrait at the bottom. And it's interpreted as a woman with a chicken, and he's getting into an argument with her, something about this chicken. It looks like he's striking her with a cane. Because he lived through so much American history, so much important American history, from the Civil War, emancipation, um, Reconstruction, segregation, Jim Crow. He did not have a safe way to record and say what he was seeing in his life. So much of what he drew often we think was sort of encoded. He would have like chase scenes of dogs chasing a rabbit that are thought to be related to Jim Crow and segregation in the South at that time. Um, so this was a safe way for him, with these sort of allegorical figures in his work, to talk about what he was seeing and express himself. So it was sort of encoded.
Someone asked, so he didn't start drawing and start artwork until 85?
So let's see, he was born in, you make me do math now. So he was born in 1853 and he started drawing 1939. So 47, 80, yeah, that's about right.
Wow.
So he may have been a creative person before that time, but nothing was saved. And probably the way he had to work, he wouldn't have had time to draw things. So he's telling the story in the only way he knew how. And the curator of the work of this exhibition says, as an elder, he sat alone, pouring his memories onto paper rather than into the hearts and minds of his children. So his children had all gone, his huge family, he was the only one left. Okay, let's move on to the next piece of art. We have another artist who has some similarities to Traylor, but very different life experiences. You can see this is a rather different style of art. So just let your eye move around the scene. This is a pretty big scene. It's 48 inches across. It's about 48. It's about 4 feet wide. And let's see, the little text in the bottom, in the bottom right area, the visible part of it, I'll read to you. They get away with the enemy's plans and recover valuable jewelry after firing thousands of tents, causing scenes of greatest confusion. So think about the style. Maybe think about, have you seen this type of drawing before? And the next slide you can go to, I have a close-up of these children. Oh, go on after that, yeah. So please respond to me about what you are seeing here and what do you think of what is in this scene? How are these children depicted?
They look like they're coming from school. There's a book.
Somebody's carrying books.
Yeah.
If you are, there's like a
football.
basket.
Yeah. Football or ball.
Are these girls or boys?
They look like girls. They have bows in their hair.
Does anyone else have another opinion?
Well, they don't all look like girls totally, do they?
No.
Well, that's true. Yeah.
Look at the naughty bits, as they would say in Monty Python.
Absolutely.
They all have bows. Yeah.
They're all going
Girls with
through
penises.
some transition.
Yes.
Yeah. Girls with penises.
You know, I'm trying to decide if that was something tied around their waist or if that was actually nudity. It looks like they have something tied around them.
Yeah, it's almost like they're jointed dolls, isn't it?
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. He was probably not drawing from life.
Right.
Okay. Could you go back to the full one? Okay, yes, thank you. So this artist is Henry Darger. And unlike Trailer, this guy left stacks and stacks and stacks of written words along with his art. So he had a very sad life history. This was a white man. Was there a question? This was a white man who lived his entire life in Chicago. He was born in 1892. We think he started his drawings in the 1920s. And to understand where he's coming from with this art, and this is one of the tamer ones, actually, there's a lot of like battle scenes and violence, and it's almost science fiction-y. It's definitely fantasy. I would, if you had to have one category for his art and his writings, it would be fantasy. So he had a really, really hard childhood, which it's believed influenced why he was making all of this creative work. So his mother died in childbirth when he was about 4 years old, and the baby was given up for adoption. His father, when he was around 10, I think, his father lost his job, and even though Henry himself seemed to have been a bright child, he learned to read and write at a young age. He actually skipped second grade. He ended up in the Chicago Asylum for Feeble-Minded Children because his dad could not take care of him. So just think of becoming basically an orphan and in a horrible, horrible place, what that does to your sense of security. This was just probably a horrible place. There were children who died in this asylum, and he tried to escape a few times before he finally made it out of there at 16. And this is, you know, in the around 1920, this is not a good place to be. Psychology is not where it is today. Once you're in there, you probably are expected to spend the rest of your life in there. So in a way, he was lucky to get out of there. He was a loner for the rest of his life. Most of his adult life, he worked as a janitor. So as an adult, he produced a 5,000-page autobiography, 2 novels. One was 15,000 pages long, which he probably began in his 20s around 1912. And lots of drawings. Some of them accompanied these novels and writings, paintings, collages, probably none of which he showed to anybody else. He died in 1973, and these weren't discovered until he had to go into like hospice basically, and his landlord discovered all these things in the rooms that he had been renting. But they were not shown anywhere, they were not exhibited anywhere until a few years after his death in 1977. So the stories that he was illustrating, this 15,000-page novel, was about this group of little girls. He called them the Vivians. And his life history in these drawings are just fodder for armchair psychologists who didn't know him. Who knows what really was motivating him or what he was doing with this art. But he saw girls as being braver than boys or men. And one interpretation of why these little girls have penises is that that's a way of showing their strength and bravery. That's how he interpreted it. He was influenced by a lot of the media at the time. You may recognize this kind of style of drawing, like animation. It reminds me of like early Disney cartoons, this kind of style. The landscapes, the way the trees are drawn. He would sometimes find things out on the street and incorporate them in his drawings, his collages. So he's telling the story of these girls who are in the middle of a war in this imaginary country trying to battle child slavery. And he's invented different races of beings. There are the evil Glandolinians, and the allies of the girls are the Blengigomenians, who have horns and wings. So if you come to the museum, you'll see a few of these really large drawings on display that are about at least 4 feet long, with scenes that he's illustrating from his books. So the time frame he was making these drawings, it was roughly the 1920s, 30s, into the 50s or so, as we don't know because nothing is really dated. So in a way, his time span goes from Shirley Temple to Leave It to Beaver. And think of the way children were depicted in those times. Even if you were a very naughty child, you were still considered very cute in the media. So that's sort of what is being reflected in this. But generally, Henry Darger is seen as making these creations in these worlds because that's what he had to do to survive. He had that horrible, horrible childhood. He didn't do this for money or fame, but he did it so he could endure. Okay, let's move on to the next piece. And again, take a look at this. This is somebody who also has some things in common with our first artist, Bill Traylor, but he has a very different life story. So, what kind of scene is this? Where do you think this person lived? Does this have kind of a mood or an emotion, a feeling that you get when you look at this? And this is pretty small. Let me look. This is only about 5 by 9 inches.
Seems pretty impressive.
For 5 by 9, I'm impressed.
No, oppressive.
Oh, oppressive. Okay.
Well, it's very dark and you have these trees hovering in a lot of darkness. And I don't know, these little houses are kind of weird.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's,
I guess you're getting the vibe that something's not quite right.
it's like the barbed wire fence. It's either like a prison or holding animals in.
Okay.
Looks like a reform school with houses for the children with barbed wire fences around it.
Okay. I like your responses. That's interesting. So you're noticing the buildings and the enclosures and just kind of there's a little bit of a darkness to this. Let's proceed a slide. I think I give the title next. Oh, back one. So this is another untitled. And James Castle was an artist who had literally no language. He was born in 1899 in Idaho. His family lived on a farm. He was born profoundly deaf, and he missed that golden time of childhood when you need to learn language. And if you don't learn it, then you're never going to learn it. So unfortunately, he missed that window. His family did send him to a school for the deaf when he was like around 5 or 6 for a few years. But at that stage, deaf education did not mean sign language. It meant you were going to be forced to acclimatize to lip reading. And he did not catch on to lip reading. So for his entire life, he really had no language, no sign language, no lip reading, no English. It didn't mean, cognitively, he did not have issues. He just did not have language. So his siblings and his parents did the work on the farm, and he did not have to do so many chores as his siblings did, which gave him free time to learn to teach himself how to draw. This is truly self-taught art. So take a look at the perspective in this drawing. He taught that to himself, which late in his life and after he died, critics were impressed that he was able to do this kind of perspective without being taught. People just assumed that you had to be taught to be able to do perspective correctly. So the inability to communicate in any complex way made him probably much more introspective and made him an observer. He understood time. He knew when Christmas was coming. He would start making gifts and things and wrapping them. He knew when the Red Skelton show was on. I don't know if any of you remember Red Skelton. He loved it was very physical humor, which attracted him. It was something he could understand and enjoy. He used the materials he could find in his own home. So in addition to his parents being farmers, they also had the mail, the post office in their house. So there's lots of papers coming in and out, the mail, circulars, magazines. So he had access to like discarded paper. Even if he was offered regular art supplies like brushes and paints, he preferred to do what he could do, what he created himself. This is so dark because it's on the back of some type of packaging. You can see the fold lines. This probably used to be the flap of a box or something. It's small, remember, it's only 5 inches high. You'll never guess what the material is that he drew with. He would take soot from his stove in the kitchen and mix it with his saliva to make a type of paint. It's not charcoal, it's not pencil, it's soot and saliva. He would take some of the like magazine pages or colored paper and soak it in water to make a kind of watercolor. He had such a huge body of work. It was actually lost twice when the family moved a couple times in the 30s. He left boxes and boxes and boxes of things made after 1931. Nobody's quite sure what all he had before then, but after the final move in 1931, most of it was kept. He stashed a lot of things away. He had boxes in attics, in the, like in the basement, wherever he could find a little nook somewhere, he would put a box of his drawings in there. So some of this stuff was recovered after he died and somebody else bought the house and found things in the walls. He, in addition to these types of drawings, and let's advance one more. I have one more example. Yeah. So not everything is like photographic like the first one was. This has kind of some mystery to it. So look at this and your guess is really as good as mine what is depicted in here. Tons of drawings. So one of his brothers-in-law was an artist and got him his first show in an Idaho gallery. And after that, he sort of got his work recognized a little further and a little further. The mainstream art world did not know what to make of this because it was like his story of being profoundly deaf and without language was seen as more important than what he was making. And his family finally got so fed up with this and the way he was being taken advantage of and disrespected that his family cut off anything to do with the art world for a decade or more. Dealers exploited and disrespected him and misrepresented him and his work. After his death, the family slowly started to re-engage when they were contacted by people who did respect the work and by the 1990s, his work became known internationally. He's one of the earliest cognitively different artists to receive recognition. So he has had a retrospective at the Philadelphia Museum of Art and other places. So these are difficult questions about the differently abled and how to categorize their art. Okay, any comments about the picture we're looking at now?
And
So-
feel free to put comments in the chat too, if that's easier than unmuting yourself. I'm still looking at the chat.
Okay. So I am seeing figures on the top row, like right in the center, top center, there seems to be a woman in a skirt, and to the right, I see another woman and maybe a man. Well, that might be a woman too, wearing a hat. His figures tended to be very boxy looking like that. He did some very interesting three-dimensional things, all made out of cardboard, some birds and other animals. Very, very whimsical almost. But some of what he put in his drawings are just mysterious. There are some drawings of like the farm with some very mysterious structures in them that nobody now knows what to make of them. Okay, let's go on. I see I have only about 15 minutes. Joshua, do you want me to still end at 2 o'clock?
How many more pieces do you have?
I think I have 4 more.
You can go a bit over, but perhaps maybe like 5 minutes per piece.
5
to
after.
speed up.
Okay.
So
If
like
people
five
want,
more minutes per piece would get you to about 5 after, and then we can
okay,
give a little bit
I'll
of time
see
for
if
questions.
I'll see if I can move along a little faster also. But if people need to leave, go ahead and just leave the meeting.
And we are recording it, so if you want to catch the
Yes.
end of it on YouTube, you can as well.
Yes. Okay, so now we have some sculptural pieces, and these are fairly tall. These are, the taller one is about 43 inches. And I think the next slide has a close-up. Now let's go one more. Next slide will be, there we go. So this is a little close-up of the faces. Okay, so any reaction to what you're seeing here, what the materials are, what the intent of the artist may have been?
Well, it seems like it could be, primitive African art, given the wood and the coloration and maybe bone being used.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, it has some roots there. Well, I'm using that as an unintentional pun, because if you go back one slide to the text with the text, they are root figures. So yeah, there are possibly some roots in African art, and you're right, there is bone. There's a variety of materials in here. These are painted roots, painted black. There's turkey bones and metal and plastic. So we have a female and a male figure. This is Bessie Harvey, who was born in 1929. She was born in Georgia and lived and worked in Tennessee. She died in 1994. She came from a very large family. She was 7th of 13 children. She got married at age 14, divorced in 1968. She raised 11 children. As a child, she liked making dolls and toys out of twigs. She had a job as a housekeeper and made dolls at night. her work eventually drew some attention, and one of the doctors at the hospital where she worked introduced her to the gallery director who in New York City, who helped get her work known. So Harvey has sort of a spiritual aspect to her work. She believes she was creating artworks as directed by God. She thought that roots and branches had indwelling spirits. She often painted in dark colors. Her works are fierce, raw, and edgy.
Someone commented that the
Many,
jewelry sort of suggests they might be royal figures or people of importance too.
oh, that could be.
Mhm.
It's sort of like a crown on the right
Mm.
and
Yeah.
jewelry. Yep, gold jewelry. Good observation. So she had many challenges in her life, being poor, Black, and female. This kind of aesthetic, these are from 1988. People would just write these off as being primitive and animistic, or did not like them because they thought they were like dark magic and out of the mainstream religion. But she persevered in making art her own way, and the rest of the world came around to seeing it as something worthwhile. Okay, let's go on to the next artist. And this is, I have two pieces by this artist, and this is someone who used his voice for racial justice. Anyone want to take a guess what the animal is on the right?
A tiger.
A tiger. Yes, stripy tiger. So go to the next slide with the title, please. The movie star and the tiger need one another. This is one of the paintings by Thornton Dial Sr. So he came to use tigers as kind of an allegory for African Americans, being fierce, regal, nimble, but also feared and hunted. So why would a movie star and a tiger need one another? Um, Given that the tiger is representing African Americans and we have a Caucasian movie star. Well, celebrity brings power and privilege. They need to form alliances. And let's go to the next example I have of his work. This is very different. This, did I write the size of this? No, the slide will see. This is fairly big though. I think this is about 4 feet high. And you can tell it's very dimensional. So what kind of mood does this bring out?
Seems kind of tragic.
Tragic. I think that's a very apt word. Let's go to the next slide with the text. Recalling the pain, that does sound tragic. So Thornton Dial was born into an Alabama family of sharecroppers just before the Depression. He worked in a Pullman Railroad car factory in Alabama as an adult, and when that factory closed, he became a full-time artist. A quote from him about his time in the factory, he said, "I've learned a whole lot about drawing from my work at the Pullman factory. I got to seeing how things you draw out can be the design for everything. Everything in the world got a pattern, the mind got to see it, the hands got to make it." And he also said, "People have fought for freedom all over the world. I try to show that struggle. It is a war to be fought. We're trying to win it." He was another person who experienced Jim Crow segregation in the South and the civil rights movement. He was very influenced by Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Early on his career, he used a lot of allegory to express what he was thinking. And sort of like our first artist, Bill Traylor, he did not feel safe expressing that explicitly to the world. So he used sort of coded figures. But as his work became better known and he developed more confidence, he became much more explicit in what he was saying. So for some years, he denied his works had any underlying meaning. He bridged the worlds of Black vernacular self-taught artists and the contemporary mainstream. In the last 20 years, he became a leader in the transition of African Americans concealing their identity and personal views to actually asserting their freedom. So he's become quite well known and has his work collected by major museums and is also a mentor to many African American artists. Let's go on to the next one, to some more sculptural work. So this is fairly large. I think this is about 2 feet high and it's dimensional. And let's go to the text slide, please. So it's probably a medicine bottle under there. And I have one more example of her work. This is Judith Scott. And yeah. So the exhibition has 4 of her pieces exhibited. Would anyone like to guess what's underneath this? Or does it remind you of anything? She's another person who all of her works are untitled. Well, if you're scratching your head, it's because usually nobody knows what is under there. Some galleries have even x-rayed them to see what types of things she puts in. They've found things like videotapes, bicycle wheels, potato chip bags, Christmas tree lights, a chair, shoes, a doorknob. I remember seeing her work at the Brooklyn Art Museum and she had done a shopping cart, which was a little more obvious. But her story is a little bit like the other deaf artists that we've had. She was also born profoundly deaf, but it was not recognized for some years. She was a twin, and her twin is an able-bodied person. Judith Scott has Down syndrome and profound deafness. She was born in 1943. Her deafness was unrecognized for 30 years. So it was assumed that she just was, had major cognitive difficulties, unfortunately. Her family put her in an institution for 30 years where she was just left with a very poor life there. When she and her twin were 40, the twin Joyce obtained custody of Judith and brought her to California. And there is an organization called Creative Growth Arts Center in San Francisco, the first center in the world for artists with disabilities. For the first couple years that Judith was there, she didn't seem to have much interest in anything, creating anything. She had just really lackluster response to it. But once they gave her some textiles and fiber like yarns, she suddenly, it just clicked for her, and she started these wrappings. So I think the next slide is a detail of this. So you can see everything an artist does has purpose to it, has choices, has decisions. So she has decided what colors to use, what materials to use, what the shapes are. There's a rhythm. Think of it as like jazz. Sometimes when I am a little bit stymied by something very abstract, I try to think of it in a musical sense. If it was a musical composition, what would you hear? During the last 18 years of her life, she created over 200 sculptures. And I will move on to our last artist in the few minutes we have, who also does work at the Creative Arts Center. Of the 43 artists in this exhibition, this is one of the artists who is still living, and he is also making work at Creative Growth Arts Center. So what I would be curious about with this is a painting that's very large. I think it's like about 10 feet wide, is your initial reaction to it might be one thing, but as you start to look at it, does your initial reaction change? It's like the more you look, the more you see. Let's go to the next slide. Another untitled piece. So I think the parentheses is probably kind of like a cataloging numerical system. This is Dan Miller, who is on the autism spectrum. So for him, orally communicating is very difficult. And a critic explained his manner of working, that what he cannot say from his mouth, it's like his words come through his hands. When he was born in 1961, and his grandmother was a teacher and spent a lot of time trying to help him to learn to read. She did it through a lot of repetition. And it's thought that this is why his work has layers like this, the repeated sort of gestural symbology that you hear, that you see in here. It's like drawing, it's like writing, it's layers and layers and layers. So at the time his grandmother was working with him, autism was not at all very well understood, and interventions that we have now hadn't been developed yet. So the repetition of his grandmother trying to teach him how to read and repeating the sounds of words again and again had an impact on him. I think the next slide might have a detail. No, okay, we'll just stay there and wrap up. So I've shared the biographies of these artists, but really the biography shouldn't be necessary to appreciate their art in itself, but give it kind of an enriching context. Communication between an artist and a viewer is always subjective. Trying to understand the inner life of somebody is always difficult. Everything in the exhibit, all these pieces, came from a private collection that are donating much of their collection to the Smithsonian. The collectors are Margaret and Douglas Robson. They are examples of so many people who help these unknown artists become better known, or known at all. Without them, they would just remain obscure. These collectors recognize their works are often misunderstood and excluded from widespread appreciation. And a quote from the catalog about this exhibition is, "Nobody is voiceless. There are only people whose voices are not heard." And with that, I will take any questions that you would like to ask or other observations. I've shown you just a tiny taste sampling of what's in the show, so hopefully you can come see it yourself.
It's very
Thank you.
inspiring, very inspiring.
Thank you very much for sharing. Can I just ask, so it's when is the show closed?
Oh, I thought about answering that question. I think it's up for at least a few more months.
Okay, well, I'll Google it and put it in the email I send
Yeah.
out with a YouTube link, but glad there's no rush because it sounds very interesting and definitely want people to go down there and take a look at it themselves. But thank you very much for taking the time to chat with us and to walk us through some really interesting and unique pieces. Does anyone have any last questions before we wrap up here?
Just thanks a lot.
I would just like to say that I have seen the show and I thought it was wonderful. I encourage everybody to go down and see it, but you've added another dimension to it. So thank you very, very much.
You're welcome. If you go in person, you'll see what I think they call groundbreakers. They've kind of called out about 10 of these artists that will have more background information on them, and there's more text in the show that is very hard for the curator to narrow down just 10 people with that, but it was felt that these people really made an incredible change in the way that self-taught art is considered in mainstream art now.
Mhm.
It's open till March of next year, so lots of time. And the crafting exhibit's open till April of next year. So don't let that put it off, but
Yeah.
it is open for a while. Any last thoughts or questions?
Thank you so much.